Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to do a detailed review of Alien Romulus. And overall, I enjoyed the movie. I think there's a lot of good things in it, but there are also a few annoying things, mainly because they are illogical. So, my number one complaint is the speed of the growth of the aliens, which was always very fast in all these movies, but it was usually within the realms of plausibility. And yet, in this movie, it's like ludicrous speed. It's totally illogical, not just in terms of biology. We can excuse that away by saying the aliens have super advanced biology, and that's fine. But in this movie, it basically violates the physical rule of the conservation of matter. Like, you cannot go from a baby and then not eating anything, not getting any materials from anywhere, and then within a minute it becomes a huge creature. And so that's the kind of thing that kind of takes me out of the movie. And I'm not saying we should sacrifice the pacing of the movie for the logic. We can simply imply that time passed without actually showing it, and that way we can still have a fast-paced movie, but still maintain some kind of logic to it. For example, in the first movie, we don't actually know how much time passed exactly between the time the facehugger jumped on Kane and until the chest burster came out. It's not specifically stated how many hours passed. Was it a day or two? We don't exactly know. And presumably when that embryo is inside the human body, it takes out all the nutrients it possibly can before leaving the host. And yet, in the new Alien movies, the facehugger jumps on you, and then a chest burster comes out almost immediately afterward. And so, if it can do that so quickly, why did it need to go into the host in the first place? Why doesn't it just get born from the facehugger? I guess it needs the host DNA to incorporate into itself, but why the need to get into it and then come out of it immediately and then grow into a huge creature right away? In the first Alien movie, after it came out of the body, it went to hide somewhere on the ship, and it was hiding in that place with a lot of moisture, I guess, with a lot of dripping water. So maybe it also took all the water into itself. So maybe when it was born, it was like a seed. It was super concentrated with very little water, and then it got some water from somewhere, and that's how it ballooned like a mushroom. And so we can come up with excuses, and a few hours passed by and so on. I think in the novelization of the first movie, they also said it raided some storage room full of food and stuff like that. So there was enough time in between to explain this kind of thing. And in Alien 2, there was also no logical problem at all, because by the time they got to that colony, a few weeks passed, and so that's enough time for all the aliens to grow as much as they want to. And in Alien 3, it took a few days, I think, until the alien came out of Ripley, so that's the most logical thing. Like, wouldn't a parasite living inside the host want to stay in the host for longer to get into another place to propagate and all of that? So just like a virus would be more effective if it doesn't kill the host right away. Like, if it can hide inside it for a while and be taken to somewhere else to spread, that will be more effective. So why wouldn't the aliens also be more effective in that way? So in the more recent movies, like in all the Alien versus Predator movies, suddenly the moment the facehugger jumps on you, just a minute later the creature comes out of you right away. So it makes absolutely no sense why the need to do it so quickly, even if it was biologically possible. Like, it wouldn't be effective for a parasite. And in this movie they sped it up even more. So we have a facehugger jumping on someone, then a few minutes later the creature comes out, then it runs away, then it sheds its skin, which is similar to how it was in the first movies. And then they also added this new stage of the creature that it forms some kind of cocoon stuck to the wall, which looks kind of like female private parts. And then the bigger alien gets born out of it. And it literally happens in minutes inside the movie. And as I said, they could have simply implied that a few hours passed, then it could make some kind of sense, but they literally have a countdown across the whole movie, because that ship is falling into the rings of the planet, and they say like 40 minutes, which the movie keeps counting, so we know it's all taking place in a few minutes. And so it makes no sense. How can the alien get the physical matter to grow as quickly as it does? Like, does it get it from the air? Does it suck all the air into itself to convert it into biological matter? It doesn't really make sense. And especially in the very end, when they had that baby, she doesn't even have a belly for the whole movie. and then she injects herself with that serum of the black goo DNA or whatever, and then within minutes suddenly she has a big belly. Then she gives birth to a cocoon, which then opens up to reveal a normal looking baby. Then it falls down to that storage room, and then literally within minutes it grows into a huge creature which is like 3 meters tall. And it was neat for me to find out it was played by an actual person. It's not a special effect. I actually saw a documentary of that guy years ago, and so when I found out that was him, that was a nice surprise. And that was a pretty creepy monster, and I liked a lot of things about it, but the way it grew from a baby to this huge creature in literally 2 minutes of screen time with the clock counting the time, so we cannot pretend as if more time passed than it did on screen, that was absolutely ridiculous. And one way they could have solved it is by saying maybe that storage place they fell into, which just looked like it's filled with sand or something, they should have said maybe it's grain, maybe it's some kind of biological food source or something, and then we can presume that the baby consumed a lot of it and that allowed it to grow so quickly. And so some kind of an excuse like that could have helped with the logic of it, and yet apparently it just literally grew from thin air into a huge creature consuming absolutely nothing. My second logical complaint is how come the Weyland-Yutani company didn't know anything in the other movies? Like, how come they were so surprised in Alien 2 to learn from Ripley about anything? Maybe they were pretending to be surprised and they actually knew all along. I guess maybe that's why they sent Ash as a spy on that ship, because they knew from the get-go that the ship is going to pass near that planet they want to investigate anyway. So I guess they knew all along about the alien, maybe from the days of Prometheus. I mean, in this movie, the character of Rook, who is the same model, I guess, as Ash, talked about how Mr. Weyland sacrificed himself to try to find the Prometheus fire and all of that. So how come they never revisited that planet from Prometheus if they knew that there was something there, that Weyland died there? And so how come they never sent any ships there again? And they could have found that alien that was left there in the end of Prometheus. So whatever happened with that? I guess maybe something happened off screen that we don't know, and they couldn't get their hands on the alien specimen in the end. So they put the android spy on the Nostromo and planned all along to get a specimen of that alien. But then Ripley blew up that ship and abandoned it and threw the alien out of an airlock. And one logical question is how come they found it so easily in the beginning of this movie? I guess I have an easy explanation for it. We can say, that shuttle was moving away from the Nostromo in a pretty straight line, and then when it blew up it wasn't completely destroyed. There was a whole bunch of wreckage that was left behind, and then the shuttle continued in a straight path, and then when the alien was ejected out of it and was pushed away by the engines, we can assume it flew roughly in the same direction as where all that wreckage was. And so when the company sent a ship to investigate that wreckage, I guess it makes sense they found the remains of that alien, which transformed itself into a cocoon to protect itself, I guess, and it was still alive inside. I guess that's possible, and so they recovered it and then took it to this Romulus and Remus space station to study it. And then did they never inform the rest of the company? How come the company never knew about any of this later on? How come they never sent anything to study that same planet that the Nostromo visited? I guess they didn't know exactly where they landed to find all those eggs in the first movie, and they had to wait for Ripley to show up 50 years later to find it out from her. And if they could find the remains of that alien floating in space, how come they couldn't figure out where Ripley flew into in her shuttle and find the shuttle earlier? I mean, this movie is taking place 20 years after the first one, and they were able to find the alien floating in space, but were not able to find the shuttle that was flying away. And another detail I always wanted to discuss about the Alien franchise is do they actually have faster than light engines? Because we never actually see that. Whenever we see any spaceships, they seem to be moving pretty slowly in space, and also the fact they have to freeze themselves to travel implies that it takes a lot of time, many years to come from place to place. I guess it kind of is contradicted in Alien 2. Aliens, I mean, when they specifically said it will take 17 days for them to get rescued, and also Newt was still alive on that colony. And so it couldn't have been years that passed in between the transmission and by the time they got there. So obviously they do have faster than light engines in this franchise, but it still takes a long time, at least weeks or months and sometimes years to get from a planet to planet. That's why they have to freeze themselves. And maybe that can help explain the timeline logical problems of why didn't the company send more ships to that place or that place to study. So it's not so easy and not so quick to get from place to place, and that's why they just didn't get around to it yet, simply because it takes so long to get there. And maybe that's another reason they started to rely on these androids more and more, because a human will have psychological issues of spending years away from home and leaving all their family behind and all of that. So you can do it a lot easier with androids, but I guess androids are really expensive. So you cannot just send the whole ships full of androids everywhere. So usually they have like one android on each ship. And that's another logical problem I have with this movie, is that they had this science officer on the space station who looks exactly like Ash from the first movie, but Ash in the first movie was a spy. They were not supposed to know he's an android until it was too late, and so obviously his face couldn't be identified as an android in the first movie. Maybe he was a prototype, maybe he was the first of his kind, and only later they put the same model out to be used as science officers on the space stations. And so I guess I can explain it, but it was kind of a small logical problem as I was watching the movie, of saying, wait, if it's a widespread model of that face, how come they didn't recognize him as being an android in the first movie, and why would the company send a spy that looks like an android that the crew will pick up? So my only explanation is that he must have been a prototype which was not yet widely used, and that's why the crew of the Nostromo didn't recognize him until he started being all glitchy. And that also brings me to this new character of this android in the movie, which, the actor did a fine job, and the character was interesting because he kind of goes through a transformation. He starts out as kind of defective, and then he gets upgraded with that small chip from the Rook android. And that's another small problem I had with it, because the androids in all these movies were always kind of semi-organic, with the white blood and all the gooey stuff inside, and suddenly they reveal, oh, actually it has mechanical parts in the neck that you can put chips in and out of it all the time. And so it kind of changed the essence of these androids from being kind of biological synthetic people to basically mechanical robots like in the older science fiction. So I guess there is no direct contradiction. I mean, you do have to have some kind of interface, and so anyway, the character was kind of interesting because he started out as kind of a defective android, which you would still think, wouldn't it still be a very expensive piece of equipment? So how come no one tried to steal him on that planet, to use him as a slave or something? Because, as I mentioned previously, androids would be very expensive, otherwise we will see a lot more of them. So how come Rain can just keep this android around as her personal property without anyone else trying to steal it? And then later it gets upgraded, and then it also becomes kind of evil, because now it's following the directions of the company, and so it cares more about the mission than people. And they also raised an interesting idea of, they mentioned in previous movies how these androids are not supposed to allow humans to get hurt, and yet what would happen in a moral dilemma if you can sacrifice one person to save more people? Then obviously the android will do that, and that might look kind of immoral to other people, the way it heartlessly would sacrifice someone by pure numerical reasoning. And so that was an interesting part of the movie, I think, the way they kind of presented moral dilemmas and the differences between an android and other people. So that was kind of neat, and I wish they would have done more with that, because we only had like 1 or 2 scenes with that kind of an idea. And also this Rook android, which obviously is very similar to Ash. He had very similar lines of dialogue when talking about the alien, how it's a perfect organism and how important it is to get it and all of that. And so it specifically said that getting the samples of the alien is more important than human beings. And yet in other scenes, when when that facehugger is on that woman, he tells the other ones to end her life or to escape and all of that. But isn't his priority to save the aliens? So why is he telling them the truth? So a lot of kind of illogical moments like that. I guess maybe because he already had the DNA samples, he already harvested the black goo out of the aliens, so he no longer needed new samples. I guess I can explain it, but he seemed to be kind of all over the place, literally, in terms of his motivations. Like one moment he's trying to help them, another moment he wants to save the mission, which is more important. And so that was all over the place. And I kind of enjoyed that cameo of the deep fake of Ian Holmes being an android again. I thought that was kind of neat. Obviously he looked a little bit fake because the effect wasn't perfect, but I thought it's okay because it fits the situation of him being a messed up android which is also physically ruined. And so it makes sense that he doesn't look fully real, since he's not a real person. And also it's not the exact same robot from the first movie, it's a different one, so maybe they also changed him a little bit. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. Overall, I thought it was a neat cameo, but it was kind of overdone, meaning it would have been nice to have 1 or 2 scenes with him, but they kept bringing him back for more and more scenes, and so they even talked with him on the screen from other places later on. So I think they should have had 1 or 2 scenes with him, then give his chip to the new Android character, and then have the new Android character turn kind of evil and be the new kind of Ash-like character. And speaking of member bearers, there were kind of a little bit too many in this movie. They kept, showing the same exact things, like they had the same toy on the table as was in the first Alien movie, or all kinds of little lines like game over as someone is literally playing a game, or get away from her, you bitch, and a lot of lines like that, which were obviously member berries and Easter eggs, but it was done in not such a subtle way most of the time, and that's why I think it was a little bit annoying, but I don't have a huge problem with that. And as for the whole issue of deep faking an actor on another actor, I personally like that. I personally think it opens up so many opportunities to play with, and so, for example, I used to do a lot of edits. I used to make mashups of different scenes from different movies and editing them together to create a new movie. And one of the limiting factors was that I couldn't always get the same actors. Like I often would watch movies with the same actor to get scenes of him from different movies and then splice them together to make it all seem as if it's some kind of new movie with that actor. But I was always limited by the actor obviously not being in every movie that I could use. But with this kind of new technology of putting any face I want on anyone else, I can basically have limitless resources. Now I can use any actor from any movie in any kind of scene and make it look like the same actor in everything, and that way create a brand new movie just using pieces of older movies. But that's just me speaking as someone who makes kind of fan edits and parodies for the sake of it. But even for a movie studio, I think this can be a good thing for the sake of continuity. A lot of times an actor dies or is unable to come back to a project of a movie franchise or a series, and then you have to replace them or write that character out of the story, and sometimes it ruins it or it kind of takes you out of it. For example, the Oracle in Matrix 3, the actress died and they had to replace her, and then they had to come up with some kind of lame excuse for why she looks different, and then it kind of takes you out of the movie since she suddenly looks different and you cannot accept her as the same character. George McFly being killed off in Back to the Future 2 because the actor didn't want to come back, and then they use prosthetics and stuff like that to make someone else look like him, and then he sued them for using his likeness, and that's obviously a legal issue. Like you would have to get the permission of the actor to use his face if you're an official company. But one way to solve it is simply sign all the actors for that possibility from the first place. Like when you're working on a series of movies and stuff like that, simply make all the actors sign an agreement that if he or she dies or is unavailable for the sequel, then they are allowed to use their likeness and put it on someone else to make it look like it's the same character. So simply sign them off on it from the first place, give them some more money for that possibility. If that happens, their family will get paid or something. So we can solve all the legal issues in a logical way that will not harm the actors. And so I personally think that's a good thing. That's, for the sake of continuity, all the times they recast people, we can solve it later on, as this technology gets better and better and easier. Maybe pick any actor we want to see in any role in any movie that ever existed. I think that will be a neat thing to play with in the future. So I'm personally in favor of this kind of technology. And the only dangerous part is that, now you can frame someone for doing something he never did. And the video evidence will no longer be reliable now, because we can always claim that someone changed the footage to make it look like it was you when it wasn't. And so in the legal criminal field, obviously that will be a problem. But in movies and entertainment, I think that's a nice idea to use. And hopefully in the near future, I'll learn to use that myself, because that will open up a whole new way to play with footage of movies and do a lot of crazy stuff that wouldn't have been possible in the past. So that's why I'm personally in favor of the deepfake method. And so whenever I see it being used, I always think it's neat, even if it's imperfect. And in this case, because we're dealing with a robot, an android, and not even the same one from the first movie, but simply one from the same model, that's why I'm totally okay with him looking a little bit off. That even adds a little bit of creepiness to it that was even better. And as for the other characters in the movie, I think that's one of the weakest parts of it, because most of the characters are not really that interesting. For some reason, they went with all kinds of teenagers that are annoying. And even the main character of Rain is kind of like the Mary Sue problem. Even though she's not obnoxious, she's not, not everyone loves her, not everyone keeps praising her and all of that, but still there is that element a little bit. And I always use the example of Ripley to say how you should do a strong female character correctly, because Ripley was not perfect. She was a badass, but she was not all knowing, all powerful, all courageous. We had whole scenes of her being absolutely terrified, but was able to overcome her fears, and that's what made her truly heroic. Not because she had no fear in the first place, it was because she was able to overcome her fears. That's what made it so amazing, in my opinion. That's what made her truly heroic. And yet here we have this female character who we do have scenes of her being scared, but it was just a little bit scared. Oh, the alien is about to eat me. Oh, I'm a little bit worried. It's not as good as Ripley was in the first Alien movies, in which she was absolutely terrified but was able to overcome that. We do have a bunch of similar looking scenes, in that elevator when Rain decides to come back to save her robot friend, and she's carrying a weapon and she's using the weapon, and all of that was badass and very similar to Ripley, but the missing parts, the missing ingredients were all those kinds of scenes of when she should have been terrified and then was able to overcome that. That would have made it a lot better and would have avoided, I would not have accused it being a Mary Sue if they did that a little bit better. And I did like all the parts in which they were using the fact that they're in space, meaning turning off the gravity for a while and then using it to their advantage, like keeping the alien acid from falling on the floor and making a hole out into space. They did that by simply turning off the gravity, and that kept all the acid floating and not falling down and not making holes in the walls, and so that was pretty neat. And so I like all those places in the movie in which they were playing with all of this in new things which were not done before. And in general, most of the special effects in this movie were pretty nice, and the way that that station was falling into the rings of a planet. We also saw some new things, like someone gets dissolved in the acid of the alien in a very graphic way that we haven't really seen before, and all the scenes of the face huggers, multiple face huggers chasing them around, was also pretty neat. I always thought the face hugger itself in some ways is more scary than the adult xenomorph. I remember many years ago I used to play that game Alien vs Predator, which was a pretty nice game. It was before the awful movies, but the game itself was pretty amazing, and it was always very terrifying playing as a human, and then you hear the noise of a face hugger crawling around, and when it jumps on your face you literally jump back from the screen because it was so terrifying. So I remember that being the scariest part of that game was the face huggers, because the moment it jumps on your screen, then that's game over, man. Game over. A lot of things like that was done really well in this movie. They brought back that sense of horror, all the grotesque elements, and even that creature in the end I kind of liked as a horror monster, apart from the fact that it grew up so quickly that it was basically magic. But the creature itself was pretty terrifying. It was similar to that creature in the end of Alien Resurrection that was a hybrid between a human and an alien. And I always liked that monster too, by the way. I always thought it was interesting the way, it wasn't 100% evil. It still behaved like a baby that wanted to be loved by its mother and all of that. So it added some kind of new layer to it, some new element to that kind of character. It wasn't just 100% evil monster and that's it. So I liked the way it was more complicated, and also it made you feel sorry for it in the end when it died. And so they did something similar here, only here it looks more human, which maybe is better because it makes it even creepier that way. It also kind of looks like the engineers from Prometheus, which doesn't really make sense. Why would it? I guess they invented the black goo which then created the aliens. So maybe it contains their own DNA as well, but they also created humans, and humans are not really that similar to the xenomorph aliens. So how come when they got the black goo from the aliens and then put it into the pregnant woman and then her baby becomes an engineer? Like, it doesn't really make sense. So if I just erase Prometheus from my memory and just look at it as it is a pretty cool monster that is very creepy. And the way it kind of found its own mother by smelling her, I guess, and we had that kind of creepy look on its face, and in some scenes it was kind of smiling. So I thought all of that made it a very creepy and effective horror movie monster. And we also have kind of a happy ending to this movie when the main hero and her android survived all these events and are now flying off to the sunset and heading to that planet they always wanted to go to, even though they implied, androids are not allowed on that planet. So we don't exactly know what will happen. And it's kind of funny to think about it with all these movie offshoots in the Alien franchise. We'll get to a situation in which a whole bunch of people in the Alien universe actually had encounters with the xenomorphs and lived to tell the tale. And yet somehow decades later, no one knew about it. Like even 200 years later, the company is still looking for a specimen of the alien. We had so many of them all over the place, and yet they still are looking for it. So that makes it a little bit ridiculous, and that's one of the logical problems that all these spin-offs create. Like so many people encounter the aliens now, and yet still the powers that be don't know anything about them and are still trying to get their hands on it, and they still didn't figure out that it's not a good idea. And also there's a scene showing how they experiment on a rat, and they gave it the black goo and then it revived it, but then it turned into a monster, but then they're not aware that it didn't work. Like Rook is still talking about how successful the experiment was, when literally in the same room we see that the rat turned into some kind of monster, and yet still people want to inject themselves with that black goo, not knowing the consequence. And so a lot of the characters behave kind of stupidly in this movie, and that's the weaknesses of the movie. I think the characters are not really that good and are just annoying. And even in Alien 4, which is considered a bad movie, which I don't agree with, by the way, at least in that movie all the characters were kind of fun. And as for the title of the movie, why is it even called Romulus? It's kind of weird, especially for fans of Star Trek who know of Romulus mainly because that's the home planet of the Romulans. And I even made a joke of it in my previous review when I put a poster making it look as if it's the Romulans fighting the aliens, the xenomorphs, and someone in my comments thought that's an actual crossover between the Alien franchise and Star Trek. But anyway, why is it actually the title of this movie? It's the name of that space station, and half of it is called Romulus and the other half is called Remus. And we even have a picture of those two babies, Romulus and Remus, nursing on a wolf. And the only connection that it has with the movie is what happens in the very end when that alien baby hybrid is nursing on its own mother, and that's kind of creepy and all of that. So that's the only real connection to the title. So why exactly did it have to be named like that? I'm not sure. And how come the evil company never bothered to check up on any of these loose threads? Like we have the space station that had actual alien samples, and then they never bothered to send a ship to recover any of it. They never bothered to find Ripley's shuttle from the first movie, even though they were able to get to the wreckage of the Nostromo, and they never bothered to revisit the planet that the Nostromo just visited, where it found the eggs. And then later they set up a colony, but until they found Ripley, they never bothered to search for that derelict ship. And how come later on they never sent anyone else to the derelict alien ship from the first movie? I mean, the colony blew up in an explosion, but did that explosion reach the alien derelict ship as well? Like, it didn't really look like that. It had to be some distance away, so the size of the explosion, it's not as if the whole planet blew up. So how come they never sent anyone to recover those original eggs again? And they were so desperate to get Ripley in Alien 3, and then they got her blood, and 200 years later they had to clone her to get the alien out of her. And so a lot of things like that don't really make sense in the timeline if we think about it all logically. So there's now all these holes, all these illogical things in the timeline. And another interesting detail, when they went into the nest of the aliens in this movie, they also had that blue fog, and that's exactly the same as the one we saw in the very first Alien movie. When they went into the derelict ship in the area with the eggs, there was that blue fog thing covering the eggs. And that was never explained in any of the Alien movies. And so is that a biological ability that the aliens themselves create to protect the eggs, or to wake the eggs up when someone is coming, or what? So it was never explained how exactly do they generate that blue fog. I mean, if it was on the derelict ship, I would presume maybe it's not coming from the aliens themselves, but from the ship. Maybe the ship try to put those eggs in stasis or something, so that was that blue fog. But now we see exactly the same thing here in the nest of the aliens. So that implies that the alien nest itself is somehow creating that blue fog, and yet it's not really explained. And so that was kind of annoying, the way that I was glad to see that again, because that's a nice attention to detail and to continuity, and yet they never bother to explain it. And so that makes it even more annoying now, because now it makes even less sense. So if it's been created by the aliens themselves, how come we never saw that in Alien 2, for example? And how exactly do they create it? I mean, the way they make the effect is obviously with lasers, but how would the aliens be able to create something like that biologically? And so it just raises more questions without giving any answers. But I guess at least now we, the fans, can discuss and debate about all of it and create our own theories. And so I'll be glad to hear your thoughts and we can discuss it in the comments below. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.